John Ray Neill was born the fifth of 8 children in 1877 in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. His father was an Irish immigrant and his mother was originally from Holland, and they ran a family laundry business in the city. Neill was enthusiastic about drawing and painting throughout his childhood, and in his later teens he enrolled into Pennsylvania Academy of the Fine Arts, but he wasn't happy there and dropped out after only 1 semester. He then went to work for a couple of newspapers for which I could find no verifiable evidence, and in 1900 he married his first wife, Elsie Barrows. The first dated example of his work I did find was this frontispiece for the book Darby O'Gill and the Good People from 1903. But more significantly, in 1904 he was commissioned to illustrate The Marvellous Land of Oz by L. Frank Baum, the author of The Wonderful Wizard of Oz. The first book, which had been illustrated by William Wallace Denslow in 1900, had enjoyed spectacular and unprecedented success in the USA. But Baum and Denslow had subsequently fallen out irreconcilably over copyright and royalty payments and had gone their separate ways. At the outset of their collaboration, Neill was obviously instructed by Baum to keep all characterizations similar to Denslow's. And having originally split the rights to the original book with Denslow, Baum was not about to make the same mistake again, so the nature of his association with Neill was that he as author would retain all copyright, a condition Neill agreed to, however reluctantly. It was also in 1904 that a book of nursery rhymes with a collection of Neill's uncredited expressive pen, brush and ink drawings was published, unfortunately let down by crude and misaligned colour overprints. And in the following year he created more formally drawn line illustrations printed in red and black for the Magic Wand stories by Tudor Jenks. 1906's John Doe and the Cherub, another free-ranging and occasionally bizarre fantasy by L. Frank Baum, was a much clearer indication of Neill's true graphic abilities, and his limited colour evocations of the strange cast of characters and their lively interplay greatly enhanced Baum's narrative. But it was the following year's Ozma of Oz with which Neill really began to establish his own visual personality, and to an extent free himself from the constraints created by the huge success of Denslow's originals. His expressive use of pen and ink meant that he couldn't help himself from bringing greater plausibility to Baum's imaginative characters and environments. In particular, Dorothy was transformed from a rather unappealing squat 6-year-old into a manifestly older and more winsome girl with more contemporary clothes and hairstyle. And of course, when Baum created entirely new characters, Neill had considerably more scope to create plenty of others more suited to his own stylistic approach, even if they still had to meet with Baum's approval. Neill continued to work on other commissions, and starting in 1908 he produced several collections of picture books which revisited existing stories. Among them were versions of Alice in Wonderland, Helen Bannerman's now contentious Little Black Sambo, and even a redrawn visualisation of Beatrix Potter's Peter Rabbit. Unfortunately, they were some considerable distance from his best work and were not improved by being crudely printed. But he also had success at this time with considerably better drawn work for the comic strip series The Little Journeys of Nip and Tuck, which owed a certain debt to Winsor McCay's Little Nemo, and it was syndicated in various newspaper supplements around the turn of the decade. In 1909 he illustrated several gift books of verse for adults, including duotone visualisations of Snowbound by John Greenleaf Whitaker and Hiawatha by Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, neither of which yielded much in the way of visual evidence. But there was also an edition of The Raven and Other Poems by Edgar Allan Poe, for which I found considerably more to show. This volume in particular gave a strong indication of Neill's abilities with more serious subject matter, and the Poe images were powerful evocations of the writer's dark Gothic writing. But whatever their merits, they failed to sell with any conspicuous success, and the series was abandoned within a couple of years of its existence. It was also in 1909 that he illustrated the third of the post-Denslow Oz books with The Road to Oz, And by this point the quality of Neill's hatched monochrome went a long way to him now laying claim to being the true, even if not the first, interpreter of Baum's outlandish fantasies. It may just be the nature of the examples I found, but the book appears to have been exclusively monochrome, not that that was in any way detrimental to their visual quality. And the evidence clearly showed that by this point Neill was being tasked to create a whole new company of characters, both romantic and comedic. This was quickly followed in 1910 by the publication of The Emerald City of Oz, and I found two supposedly complete editions of this book online, both of which featured only pen and ink drawings. But further searching also came up with a small selection of exquisite watercolour originals, which were apparently only published in the earliest edition. And they are highly revealing of the subtlety and delicacy of his application of washes, an aspect of his talent not well served by much of the printed material. The same year saw the publication of The Uncrowned King, an example of Neill exploring the visual evocation of less frivolous material. This was a medieval romance written by Harold Bell Wright, and Neill rose to the challenge with a collection of very plausible figure-based images printed in a suitably sombre and aged-looking duotone palette. In 1911 another collaboration with Baum was published, but this time it wasn't an Oz book. The Seafarers gave Neill the opportunity to create a collection of particularly descriptive pen and ink fantasy drawings with a whole new repertory company of characters, which explored the essentially underwater scenarios of Baum's narratives with considerable graphic authority. And in addition to a large number of finely executed monochromes, there were several equally enchanting limited colour, tonally rendered illustrations set within a particularly attractive and complex border. The pair capitalised on the success of The Seafarers and collaborated again on another story featuring the same protagonists for 1912's Sky Island, which used aerial adventure in precisely the same manner as they had earlier explored undersea themes. And unlike the earlier book, this volume featured quite a few full-colour narrative images, which ranged from the sedate to the energetically composed. And in addition to his by now expected authority with the depiction of human characters, he also produced an equal number of spectacularly imaginative and even nightmarishly grotesque fantasy creatures. The next Oz book was 1913's The Patchwork Girl of Oz, and Neill's pen and ink evocations of the characters clearly showed he was at the height of his imaginative and technical powers, and his images alone were more than enough reason to engage with the narrative. That he was not receiving royalties based on sales borders on the criminal as far as I'm concerned, given that they were every bit as crucial to the book's success as the text by this point. In 1914 he illustrated this sentimental series of images about marriage, which I can only assume was for an article in a woman's magazine of the day. And he also created this engrossing colour piece of a young boy daydreaming about the characters and events of Treasure Island, which I suspect was also for magazine publication. But there was no letting up in the torrent of Oz books being generated by Baum, and the same year saw the publication of TikTok of Oz, with a large volume of yet more pen and ink illustrations possessed of Neill's expected remarkable sensitivity. And as a welcome bonus, the book also featured yet more which were created and printed in full colour. And although the print was far from the finest quality, featuring all too visible dot halftone screens, the inclusion of colour pages certainly contributed to the book's popular appeal. In 1916 his Easter Bunny characters first appeared on the cover of the Pictorial Review magazine, and they were popular enough to appear again as an Easter supplement in McCall's magazine a couple of years later. Also in 1916 Neill was published in the Housewife magazine with a collection of charming pen drawings gathered under the title The Flower Fairies, for which he also wrote the verse. 1918's The Tin Woodman of Oz returned to the use of one of the original characters created by Denslow as the central figure in this adventure. And unlike the transformation of Dorothy, both he and his friend the Scarecrow were still recognisable as the same characters, even if there had been some minor changes added by Neill. but the mix of monochrome and colour pages he created for the story made for another charming and fanciful addition to the ever-growing series. A few years earlier, Neill had been divorced from his first wife, and in 1919 he married Margaret Lavinia Carroll, and they later had 2 daughters. That was also the year that L. Frank Baum died following the publication of The Magic of Oz, but he'd already completed the next in the series, Glinda of Oz, which was published with a collection of sensitively drawn and coloured illustrations by Neill in 1920. Following Baum's demise, the publishers turned to the writer Ruth Plumley Thompson to carry on with the series, which was too much of a money spinner to abandon. And although it was Baum's name on the cover, her first was The Royal Book of Oz, published in 1921. And the stories continue to blend existing established characters with new additions. In this book, the Scarecrow took centre stage, and Neill's older, slimmer Dorothy also put in a significant appearance. The scenarios described in the text were ever more outlandish in order to keep the young readers entertained, and Neill seems to have welcomed the agreeable creative challenge they constituted. In 1922, Neill illustrated the book Children's Poems That Never Grow Old, a collection of verse chosen for young readers which were tellingly illuminated by Neill with a series of diverse but essentially character-based images of his usual high standard, but which, like some of his other work, were rather let down by less than sophisticated printing. 1923's The Cowardly Lion of Oz fared better in that regard, and it was another return to a starring role for one of the original creations, which prompted a collection of colour illustrations of considerable charm and narrative appeal from Neill, who never put in what could be considered a poor or even below par performance for the entire series. And although more followed at a general rate of 1 per year, Neill carried on working for others and created illustrations, usually monochrome only, for mainstream magazines, and even produced chapter headings and spot illustrations for a couple of pulp magazines, including Argosy and Adventure. It was also in 1923 that his illustrated edition of Andersen's Fairy Tales was published. And somewhat oddly, other than the cover, there were only 2 colour illustrations. The rest were monochrome, set within the text, and unfortunately I struggled to find much usable evidence. In 1925, Neill also created some atmospheric pen drawings for Victor Hugo's Les Miserables, but I found just 3 examples to show. Whether he only created this trio, or there were others which have slipped through the cracks, I can only speculate. In 1926, The Curious Cruise of Captain Santa was published, a book written by Plumley Thompson, and illustrated by Neill with line drawings, some of which were reproduced as duotones. And it showed that the pair had a symbiotic creative relationship, which was guaranteed to please children. In 1928, he was one of several prominent illustrators chosen to feature in Arthur Guptill's book Drawing with Pen and Ink, and it's easy to see why. I have no idea where or even if these examples were originally published, but they were obviously leprechaun themed and an object lesson in expressive pen control. Otherwise, the available evidence suggests that it was his commitment to the Oz series, as written by Plumley Thompson, which occupied most of his time. In fact, she actually wrote more books than Baum had by the time she had finished. And rather than simply go through them in shopping list fashion, I have picked out a few of the more fascinating or particularly well-drawn images he continued to create for the large series she authored. And his tireless imagination and dedication to creating the most telling and credible images possible remained constant throughout the rest of the 1920s and right through the following decade. If anything, the illustrations he created for Plumley Thompson's authored stories, which increasingly distanced themselves from the core character established decades earlier by Baum and Denslow, were arguably his finest and most visually sophisticated creations. And so the Oz books continued on this successful basis up to 1939, when Plumley Thompson stopped writing them, following a dispute with the publishers. But whether this was over creative or financial matters or both isn't recorded. But the upshot was that the task of writing the stories, in addition to illustrating them, was now offered to Neill. The first was The Wonder City of Oz in 1940, and while it's not my purpose to comment on the relative merits or otherwise of Neill's writing, I feel confident in my assertion that his drawings continue to be the major unique selling proposition of the book, even though all appear to have been monochrome only. The same was true of The Scalawagons of Oz, which followed in 1940, and the last to be published was Lucky Bucky in Oz in 1942. There was another, titled The Runaway in Oz, scheduled for the following year, and although Neill had written it, it was not yet illustrated, and that was the year he died of heart failure at the age of 65. In his lifetime, Neill illustrated 35 Oz books, each one containing over 100 illustrations. So even though not the first Oz illustrator, it's undoubtedly true that for many he will always be considered the man who brought the books to life for generations of children around the world, and particularly in the USA. This video is a far from complete review of Neill's work, and I've left a lot of Oz illustrations in particular out. But I've tried to keep the content as varied as possible, and I hope that what is included has either introduced you to or reminded you that John R. Neill was a significant illustrative talent in the early 20th century. And here are a few more to play us out, which I hope will reinforce that idea.